The 90s was one of the most popular eras for anime, and it factors as a huge reason for why it is as popular in the West as it is today. Be it due to Jetix or Adult Swim, it would appear the mass love for this decade of anime comes down a lot to nostalgia. You may have also heard the question, however, what happened to the anime of today? This is generally used as a point of comparison to favour the anime of the past over that of the present. I want to talk about why the vast majority, out of all periods in anime history, prefer anime from the 1990s, and why, aside from nostalgia, it is held on this pedestal as something better than what we have today. I think a lot of these perspectives rely on the differences between formats of animation being used. I don't think it's a massive hate against how digital animation is bad per se. No matter what you may think of it, as every day passes it becomes clearer and clearer to see that digital has a long and perhaps indefinitely prosperous road ahead of it. But I think, despite nostalgia being one of the big motivators behind this opinion, there may actually be some artistic merit behind it too. For those who aren't aware, the format of animation dominantly used from the 1960s to the 1990s was a traditional cell animation, which would involve brushing acrylic paint onto a thin, translucent sheet. This sheet is a single frame of animation. This is then situated atop a painted background for the particular shot in question, which would then be recorded onto film stock with a 16mm camera. Whilst there were softwares emerging for paper animation at the time, the analog format clinged on for a little bit longer, and thankfully this allowed for some absolutely monumental classics to release. The 90s contained the absolute pinnacle that this format had to offer. From Berserk 1997, Neon Genesis Evangelion, Cowboy Bebop, Yu Yu Hakusho, Ghost in the Shell, Hunter x Hunter, Sailor Moon, Pokemon, Master Keaton, Nadia, and the list just goes on and on and on. You might be wondering why the 90s is singled out, even when previous eras also utilised this same method. The exception that the 90s holds is that digital was just being conceptualised. With paper animation and digital colouring appearing at the end of the decade, we have two massively different formats being used at the exact same time. It was almost advantageous that there was more than one format on the go, as this offered a wider landscape of styles and aesthetics for not just anime, but all of animation at the time. This was something that the 80s, 70s, and 60s all just didn't have. The entire theme of a show can hinge upon the execution of its presentation, even coming down to this very format. Shows like Serial Experiments Lain simply wouldn't be the same if it was done digitally. With the technological special effects being an incremental element of the show's themes and visuality, I think it's important that, at its base, Lain was done analog, as it adds a great contrast to the real world and The Wire. The atmosphere between the two is as clear as night and day, and ended up fueling a monumental anime that evoked an appropriately strong sense of depersonalization. To conjure more examples, think of Trigun's Lonesome World being redone in digital. Oh wait, it already exists and lacks the same impact that the original had. Imagine Neon Genesis Evangelion's Eva fights with their weight and choreography being done this way. Oh wait, it has been, and now the fights just look like an episode of Super Sentai. Imagine the world of Boogiepop Phantom having an adaptation that did this. My point is, shows these days lack even the option of doing things traditionally due to budget and limitations. Cells aren't widely available like they used to be anymore. That part of the industry is dead. It's ironic that the look of the Evangelion rebuild films aren't as real as they used to be, as the original Evangelion TV series reputedly struggled with budget limitations and finished with a final episode that had to be slapped together with these limited resources. And yet, it sparked so much more interest and fascination with the show. The lack of resources but requirements for an episode inspired the studio to get more creative. To go back to one of the shows that I just listed, we have another direct comparison between old and new, analog and digital. I am of course talking about Boogiepop Phantom and Boogiepop and Others. I know Boogiepop Phantom was technically aired in early January 2000, making it a 2000 anime, but if we just take production time into account, we can... you know what I mean. Boogiepop Phantom was made completely on cell and would have looked gorgeous enough. The cells that are floating out there on the net are proof enough of that. But if you watch the show, you will see that they added a variable sepia tone to every shot to give a sense of unease throughout. And it works wonders. The series is really bleak and morbid, and gets incrementally more so throughout the whole show. The last episode takes place a year after the events of the main series, and in it, the filter comes off, revealing a bright and colourful world. It would be ridiculous to deny the power that the aesthetic of the format had on this show. The recent adaptation, Boogiepop and others, however, takes such a, let me emphasize, not bad, but lamentable approach that it can be really boring to watch after having seen the sheer intensity of its predecessor. Whilst the music and structure of the show is spot on and a million times more comprehensive than the last, the visuals of the show illustrate the problems that digital can have in the face of the older ways. A colour palette that is super clean, fight sequences that are borderline over-animated, and a super generalised aesthetic that doesn't even try to stand apart from the crowd when compared to older anime. The physical presence of cell animation is such that not much else is needed to be edited into the animation to make it look better, and when it is, it often completely changes the aesthetic of the show, like Boogiepop Phantom. With digital, it's a lot easier to make things look sharp and smooth from the offset, but I think that also has its downfalls. When things look as good as they do in digital, it makes it harder to do something like overlay a sepia filter onto it without thinking that's too much. Whilst it's great to be able to say, oops, I fucked that line up, but thankfully I can just edit undo, I think it's this point right here that we have to blame for everything. And this is where I link back to what I was talking about with creativity. The convenience of digital animation is the true culprit here. Unlike the limited resources or practical applications that were needed to be done with preciseness back then, there is a lot more safety when it comes down to these things nowadays. But that safety can unfortunately hinder the creative process by taking less risks because of how good things look. And the result, I fear, is this generalized aesthetic that we have with so many anime of today. Where the past had highly stylized and unique looks and color palettes, today doesn't just seem dull from oversaturation, but dull from a creative standpoint as well. Being an animation student, one of the first things I was taught to do to improve my artwork was to do line work in non-erasive pen. When you try not to rely on an eraser for safety, be it through increased concentration or preciseness, you will find yourself naturally producing a much nicer piece of work. This lack of inhibition is what gave 90s anime the cutting edge. They couldn't just edit undo, and if they didn't have the budget to afford paper animation software, then they would have to make do with cell, soldiering through with the best that they could manage. Other workarounds to ease the animation job on cells included still frames, and I don't think there can be a greater example of this than Berserk 1997. The series, whilst at times used its stills almost extensively, Berserk is looked back upon as a show which really made the most out of its budget, with amazingly detailed paintings that convey its movement with great emphasis when it needs to. Another factor that we can't forget is the aspect ratio. Typically, cell-based anime that were aired on televisions in the 1990s were all produced under the 4:3 aspect ratio. Whilst paper animation in the early 2000s were also done with a 4:3 screen ratio, the expense of cell animation not only meant that things needed to be done conservatively, but it also meant that more of a focus was put on framing and composition of shots, as opposed to how dynamic and free-flowing things are today. This sounds like a bad thing for the anime of the 1990s, but this couldn't be further from the truth. To compensate for the limitations placed upon them and the fact that they didn't have unlimited frames, anime of the time was more likely to hone in on this with incredibly strong storyboards. It's not like that doesn't exist today, of course. Composition is strong with many series today, but with a lack of any limitation, the possibility of losing sight of things in today's anime has grown exponentially. Flops happen for even the biggest of series these days, with Berserk, Kingdom, and Tokyo Ghoul especially getting completely screwed over by their poorly thought out directions. I think it's important to remember that this is not always the case, however. Some productions master the benefits that digital has to offer and come out on top more so than their predecessors. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Dororo spring to mind when thinking this way. Not only can things be better than they were in the past with digital, but genuine marvels of animation that bring digital into a fold of its own can emerge. The Monogatari series' immense sense of direction is only possible thanks to the time that the digital technique affords them. The same can be said of movies such as Your Name or The Red Turtle. It's all about how this can be utilised in as best a way as possible. So, in summary, what happened to anime? Nothing short of an entirely different creative landscape where things are evolving and growing every single year. Perhaps the wider variety of mediums influenced the greater popularity of anime from older times. And perhaps that was what contributed to the boom in different franchises that were created in that decade. Unfortunately for one of those mediums, it would become unprofitable and therefore stagnant. Digital, whilst less than we had before, is at least something that can never become stagnant, and that fact alone renders the entire debate of what is better completely meaningless. It's a fairly straightforward sentiment, but one that I feel can't be stressed enough.